A long time ago, a good-hearted king and the most beautiful queen lived in a kingdom far, far away. This king and queen's greatest wish was to have a baby girl. One day, the queen was taking a walk by the lakeside and thinking about her wish, and suddenly, a frog jumped out of the lake and landed in front of her. It told the queen that her wishes would come true, and she would finally have a baby girl after 1 year. The queen returned to the palace in joy. And the frog's prophecy really came true. The king and the queen were blessed with a baby girl exactly 1 year later. They were so happy that they decided to hold a celebration at the palace for the coming of their daughter. All of the kings, queens, princes and princesses and the common folk were invited to this celebration. However, the most special place was reserved for the 13 fairies. Each fairy was going to give a present to the little girl. These presents were not ordinary gifts. These presents were magical. Each fairy gifted the little girl with a trait. The first fairy pointed her wand to the little girl and gifted her with beauty. The light emerging from her wand enveloped the little girl and then faded out. In turn, all of the other fairies gave their presents. The second fairy gave her happiness, the third courage, the fourth fairy gave her honesty, the fifth modesty, the sixth fairy gave the little girl conscience, and the seventh fairy gave her health. The eighth fairy gave her wisdom, the ninth love, the 10th fairy gave her a heart full of kindness, and the 11th fairy gave her talent for everything. Just as the 12th fairy was getting ready to give her gift, it started to get darker and darker. The ground was shaking, as everybody in the ballroom was looking around in fear and curiosity for what was happening. A dark cloud started to form, and then the 13th fairy appeared and glided down to the ballroom. Everybody was staring at the 13th fairy in fear and worry. The 13th fairy was a dark and evil fairy, and because of this, the king had not invited her to the celebration. However, she heard of the celebration and came without invitation. After entering the ballroom, she stood beside the baby and said, "Congratulations, my king. You have a very beautiful daughter. But while everybody is invited, you forgot to invite me to the celebration." The king was embarrassed because he knew he shouldn't be prejudiced against anyone. He apologized to the 13th fairy, but the 13th fairy did not look like she was going to forgive. She was very upset that all of the fairies, kings, queens, and common folk were invited, while she was not. "There will be a punishment for this," she said to the king, and pointing her wand at the baby, she said that she now cursed the baby. "This girl will live a very good life. She will be very happy and she will be loved. However, on the day of her 16th birthday, the needle of a spinning wheel will prick her finger and she will die." Before the king could understand what was going on, the light from her wand enveloped the baby and faded away. The king ordered his soldiers to seize the 13th fairy, but as soon as the soldiers moved, the fairy pointed her wand at them. The light from her wand pushed the soldiers back, and then the fairy started to levitate, cackling. She entered into the dark clouds, and then she disappeared with the clouds. The surroundings started to return back to normal. The shadows were gone, and people were gathering again. The queen was crying, having heard the curse, and the king was very sad. Then, the 12th fairy approached the king and told them that they shouldn't worry and she could fix this. The 12th fairy was not as strong as the 13th fairy, so she couldn't remove the curse, but she could weaken it. She pointed her wand towards sunlight and told her that she wouldn't die on her 16th birthday. She would fall into a 100-year-long sleep, and only true love could wake her up from this sleep. The light from her wand surrounded the baby and faded away. The king and queen were very happy to hear that her daughter wasn't going to die, but they knew they wouldn't live for 100 years. The fairy saw their sadness. "Don't worry," she said. "With sunshine, the whole kingdom will fall into sleep, and she will wake up with them." Even though this was some consolation, the king's worries continued. He ordered his men to destroy all of the spinning wheels in the kingdom. So, the king's men gathered all of the spinning wheels in the kingdom and burned them. Time passed and Sunshine grew up. As she was growing, she started to show all of the features bestowed by the 11 fairies. Everyone loved her. She won the love of all of the common folk, the soldiers, and the people in the palace. On her 16th birthday, she was playing in her room in the palace. That day, the king did not allow her to leave her room because he was worried about the curse, and he placed guards at her door. Sunshine was bored all alone in her room on her birthday and was very frustrated. Suddenly, she noticed a door, which she had not seen before. She was sure that the door did not exist before. She cracked the door open in curiosity and peeked inside. Inside, an old lady was spinning wool on a spinning wheel. She quietly approached her side. She was seeing a spinning wheel for the first time in her life. She asked the old lady what it was, and the woman explained to her that it was a spinning wheel and she could try it if she wanted to. Sunshine sat behind the wheel, and as soon as she laid her hand on the spinning wheel, the needle of the machine pricked her finger. She stood up in pain. Sunshine's head started to spin, and she was seeing that the old woman was changing. She was changing into someone else. With her head spinning, and in fear, she started walking to her room. And as she passed through the door, she couldn't endure any more, and she fell to the ground. She couldn't keep her eyes open, and she finally fell asleep then and there. With her, everyone and everything in the kingdom fell into an involuntary sleep. At this moment, the old woman passed through the door, but she wasn't the old woman anymore. This was the 13th fairy herself. Laughing, she disappeared in a puff of smoke. Just then, the other 12 fairies arrived in Sunshine's room. They saw her on the floor and moved her to her bed. She looked so beautiful in her sleep that they started calling her Sleeping Beauty. And after laying her in the bed, they left the palace. Time passed. The life in the kingdom had come to a stop. The only thing that didn't stop was the thorny, huge, scary bushes that surrounded the entire kingdom and the palace. Meanwhile, the story of the Sleeping Beauty was heard in all of the different kingdoms. In time, many princes arrived and tried to overcome the bushes and wake Sleeping Beauty, but none of them were able to succeed. When cut, the bushes would grow even longer and never gave passage, because the bushes would open the way only to the prince who could give Sleeping Beauty his love. 100 years passed. One day, a prince was passing near the place with his soldiers. One of his soldiers told the prince about the story of the place, and the prince decided to ride his horse to the palace alone. When he got close to the palace, he saw the horrible, thorny, huge bushes. He dismounted from his horse, drew his sword, and started cutting the bushes. But the bushes would retreat as he pushed forward. It was as if they were allowing him to pass. The prince started to advance in wonder. Every living being in the city was sleeping. The prince quickly entered the palace. He climbed the stairs to Sleeping Beauty's room and finally saw the princess. As soon as he saw, he was so enchanted by her beauty that he fell in love then and there. He called to the princess, but she wouldn't wake up. Prince was so in love that he couldn't resist and dropped the princess a kiss. With that kiss, the 12th fairy's magic came true. The curse was removed at that instant. The princess finally opened her eyes and she saw the prince who had brought her back to life. She too fell in love as soon as she saw him. With the princess waking up from the sleep, the whole kingdom also started to wake up. And the thorny bushes surrounding the palace disappeared. As soon as they woke up, the king and the queen ran to the princess's room and saw that the princess was also awake. They were overjoyed. Sunshine told them that what woke her up was the prince's love. The king and the queen gave their permission to this prince who had saved their daughter, as well as the whole kingdom. So, the prince turned to Sunshine and asked her to marry him, and Sunshine accepted his proposal without thinking. They got married with an amazing wedding and lived happily ever after.